Hi, I'm Lydia McGrew, and I'm here today to keep on talking about gospel reliability and arguments for Christianity and other such cool connections, especially to probability theory, which is an area of my specialty and my publications. So I've chosen today to talk about something that was raised on social media by a Facebook friend of mine named David Paulman, and he knows that I'm going to be talking about this today, and that's fine with him, even though I'm disagreeing with something that he raised. And I'm going to confess that a major reason why I am talking about it is because it gives me a chance to do some probability theory and relate some issues of independence and so forth to the issues of arguments for Christianity, and I love to do that. It's kind of geeky and it's kind of fun. So I'm not actually saying that a lot of people have the concern that David had, but I still think that some people might, and it gives me a chance to bring in some interesting connections to probability. So the issue that David raised went something like this. I'm paraphrasing here, but he was talking about gospel reliability and Christianity and the argument from prophecy. And what he suggested was that once we have a lot of evidence for the reliability of the Gospels, we already have a very strong argument for the truth of Christianity. And then the argument from prophecy does not contribute significantly to the argument for Christianity as a separate argument in and of itself. And upon inquiry, he, and a little exchange that he and I had in the thread, he elaborated that he thought that perhaps this was something to do with independence, because the argument from prophecy and the other arguments for Christianity, which I take it involved the resurrection, he didn't say, but that he was probably thinking of the argument from the resurrection, are both dependent on gospel reliability, and that therefore they're not independent, and that therefore once we have a strong argument for Christianity from the resurrection, depending upon gospel reliability, then the argument from prophecy can't contribute much anymore in an independent fashion. And I think that's incorrect. I think that's a mistake. Of course, how strong a given argument from prophecy is a separate question in itself, but it really has nothing to do with its not being independent of the main line of the resurrection. You might have a stronger or a weaker argument from prophecy, but that just has to do with the features of that argument, not with the fact that it depends upon gospel reliability. So in itself, an argument from prophecy can definitely be, and generally will be, independent of the argument for the resurrection, as an argument for the identity of Jesus, his being Messiah, his being God, the truth of Christianity, and so forth. But it might be stronger or weaker. So I thought it would be fun to address some of these issues. The first thing I want to address that's possibly lying behind here is related to what we call measures of confirmation, and I don't want to say too much about that, but in probability theory, there are differences of opinion about what is the best way to measure confirmation. And one measure that I think is a very poor measure is what's known as the difference measure. And so you have your probability of some hypothesis H before you take a given item of evidence into account, and then you have your probability after you take it into account. You just subtract one from the other. It's a difference, straightforward difference, and then you say, well, gee, that doesn't look like very much sometimes. Now, a big problem with this is that if the prior of H was already quite high based on other arguments, then, the highest it can be is 1. So if you're already close to 1, the difference might not be very much, because all you're doing is sticking more 9s on after, it was 0.99, now it's 0.999, and that's not a very big difference. But that doesn't mean that the second argument you brought in was weak. It just may mean that you're way over justified, that you have multiple really good arguments. I'm not saying that the argument from prophecy is equal to the argument for the resurrection, or from the resurrection to the truth of Christianity, the argument for the resurrection. I'm just pointing out that the difference is not a good measure of confirmation. So to illustrate this, suppose that I had a long email exchange with a person, and consider the force that would have for the proposition that Joe exists. And I've had a long email exchange with Joe. Then I also meet him in person, or someone who claims to be him in person. That's also a really strong argument that Joe exists. So if I take one of them into account, maybe I have a 0.99 probability that Joe exists from that one by itself, and maybe I can only put more nines after the decimal point when I actually meet him in person. But that doesn't mean that meeting him in person was a weak argument that he exists. I mean, that would have been a really strong argument by itself as well. It's just that I have more than one really strong argument. So that's why it's better to measure confirmation in a different way, where we focus on the force of that item. And there are other measures. In Tim's and my work, we generally use what's called the L measure, which is the what we call the Bayes factor, and I'm not going to go into details. There's also something called the R measure, which doesn't have as many problems. But the point I'm just making in layman's terms is that you can have more than one really strong argument for a conclusion, and the fact that the first argument brings it up to a high level doesn't mean that the second argument is not strong. Okay, so that's one thing that may have lay behind David's thought. Another thing concerns independence and a given source and the importance of the reliability of that source. So in addressing this first in this video, I'm going to make a simplifying assumption, and then later I'm going to withdraw that simplifying assumption. So the first thing I'm going to do is, let's suppose that we only have one gospel. We actually have four. Or let's suppose that you're only talking about one person, like one person who's making multiple reports to you. And that person, let's say in this analogy, tells you multiple things that are relevant to the proposition that Jim is a great guy. Okay? So you have Bob, and he tells you one story about how Jim helped him and came to his house and helped him to change a tire on his car at a time that was really inconvenient to Jim, but he did it anyway. And then on another occasion, Bob tells you about how Jim once raised funds for a child who was in need. Okay, so both of these stories tend to support the hypothesis Jim is a great guy. Now, do we say that they are non-independent and that one of them doesn't add anything once we have the other one because they both come from Bob? Well, our first concern might be that what I've called independence on the negation, and I've published quite a bit about this. So suppose that Jim isn't a great guy and that for some reason, Bob is biased and he's just kind of for whatever reason, making up stories about how Jim is a great guy. So that would be dependence on the negation, this bias and this tendency to fabricate Jim is a great guy stories. And so when we do have just one source, we do have to be concerned about that. And what was interesting was that in the original concern or objection here, David Paulman was saying, when we have lots of evidence that the Gospels are reliable, the arguments become non-independent. Well, it's actually exactly the opposite. If you had lots of evidence that Bob is really reliable, other evidence about him, that he's really scrupulous about the truth and wouldn't make stuff up, that's when you don't have to worry about that bad kind of dependence. You don't have to worry anymore about his making up Jim stories. And that's exactly when you can just take these different Jim stories more or less at face value and say, wow, so now here's a data point that Jim is a great guy. Here's another data point that also supports that Jim is a great guy. And they're separate pieces of information. And in that sense, they're different, right? in that sense, they're independent, that they're separate stories. You might have only had one story from Bob about Jim helping you, and then you would say, well, who knows what Jim's like the rest of the time, right? But when you have multiple stories, then the more stories you have about Jim in multiple contexts and circumstances showing his kindness, that adds that puts in more and more and more evidence that Jim is a great guy. Now, similarly, if I have lots of evidence that Luke is an excellent reporter and that he's scrupulous about history and that he doesn't make stuff up, then I've got the evidence of his report of Jesus' post-resurrection appearance, and I can trust that he was taking that back to people who were in the know, and then that's really good evidence for Jesus' resurrection and so forth, because the original witnesses claimed it, and then we've got the whole rest of the argument for the resurrection about their risking death and so forth. And then I've also got Luke reporting that Jesus was born in Bethlehem. So let's take Jesus was born in Bethlehem as our example of a supposedly fulfilled prophecy. I would also note here that Luke himself never mentions that fulfills prophecy. Matthew does. Luke doesn't. So I don't even know if Luke knew that it fulfilled prophecy. But he reports it. And so if I've got reason to trust Luke, other reason to trust Luke, then that's actually mitigating my concerns about the bad kind of dependence. I don't have to worry about that dependence on the negation where Jesus isn't really God, Jesus isn't really the Messiah, Christianity's false, and Luke's just making stuff up. So now what I really have are two different data points supporting Jesus' messiahship. I've got his being born in Bethlehem, and then if I happen to know Micah 5:2, on the basis of my background, that fulfills prophecy. And then I've also got the report of him rising from the dead. I'm just going to throw in here, too, that what counts as the content of Christianity is going to depend on what's in our original sources. So the statement that Jesus is the Messiah is only part of the content of Christianity, in part because we believe that he fulfilled messianic prophecy and because we have reported that he claimed to be the Messiah, for example. So that's another way in which these are independent, because they're independent statements about what we even count as part of Christianity. So if Christianity is true is our proposition, well, what is Christianity? So that's another thing. But even if we take Jesus is the Messiah, his rising from the dead is evidence that he's the Messiah. So Luke's report that supports that he's rising from the dead is a data point there. And his being born in Bethlehem is evidence that he is the Messiah. So Luke's report that he was born in Bethlehem is a different line of evidence there. And in that sense, they are independent. And they are all the more independent in the relevant way, the more evidence I have otherwise that Luke is a good source, a source that doesn't make things up. We can also see that these are separate data points and that they do contribute separately to it by thinking of it in terms of prior probability and posterior probability. So if you knew that Jesus was born in Bethlehem and that in that sense he fulfilled that bit of prophecy or some other bit of prophecy and you had evidence that he fulfilled that, that would be in place before he even died. Much less before you had reports that he rose from the dead. So the fact that we can think of this as we call it diachronically across time, and one is we can model it as being relevant to the probability before the reports of the resurrection and raising that probability of his being someone very special, his being God or his being Messiah, etc., and hence raising the prior probability of the resurrection. Then we get the reports after he dies and he rises again. That itself is a mark of the independence of the arguments, that they both contribute to the proposition that Jesus is God or that Jesus is the Messiah in different ways that can be modeled across time. Okay, so this is kind of cool. Now I'm going to point out that we can relax that simplifying assumption. Okay, that I said, suppose you only had one source. Suppose you only had Bob. Suppose we only had Luke. and yet we had other evidence of the truthfulness of this source. But we don't. We have better than that. We have 4 Gospels. And in the case of Jesus being born in Bethlehem and the report of that, we actually have 2 Gospels that report that, Luke and Matthew. And they appear so independent that actually contradictions have been alleged between their reports of Jesus' infancy and birth. They're very different reports. And of course, as you know, if you follow this channel, I have a series on the virgin birth where I discuss that. So for his being born in Bethlehem, we aren't just dependent on one source. And also for post-resurrection appearances, we aren't just dependent on one source. So there as well, we shouldn't just lump together and say, well, it's all about the Gospels. The Gospels' reliability, as if the Gospels were just one source. So we've got different lines of evidence for, let's make the proposition, Jesus is the Messiah. His being born in Bethlehem, or his being crucified and the soldiers cast lots for his garments, let's say. Psalm 22. That being a line, because these are separate things reported in the Gospels, okay? And his rising from the dead, appearing to his disciples, that's another line. These are different lines, and in that sense, they contribute different things to that probability. But we also have different lines of argument for these facts, because we have reports that come from different Gospels that appear to have a measure of independence as coming from different witnesses as well. So we've got different lines supporting the proposition that Jesus is the Messiah, and also that he rose from the dead, and so forth. So this is really cool because it gives us a very tough texture. So I think that was fun to address those questions of independence, and I'll be tagging David Paulman when I post this, and I hope he will find it convincing and useful. And if any of you were ever concerned about that question of independence and gospel reliability and the argument from prophecy, I hope that will be of use to you as well. And then there might be other things that I've touched on here that are useful. I'm also going to link, if I remember, a post that Jonathan McLatchie did recently on arguments that are relevant to the prior probability of the resurrection. And that is connected to what I've been talking about here too. And he talks about the trilemma, liar, lunatic, or Lord. He talks about arguments from prophecy and other types of arguments that contribute to the prior. And that doesn't mean that, Jonathan and I would evaluate equally all of the arguments from prophecy that he evaluates. That's not really the point, but that he's saying that these arguments are relevant to the prior probability, and in that sense are independent arguments for the truth of Christianity, independent arguments that raise the prior probability that Jesus rose from the dead, even aside from our strongest direct evidence that he rose from the dead. Variations of strength in arguments do not mean that the arguments that are somewhat weaker have no force. So we want to look at them in themselves and say, okay, what force does this have? That's all really cool, and I hope that you will subscribe and like all of this content that I'm putting out here. And I will, next week, I think I'll probably have another reading from my husband, Tim McGrew, from one of the great works of older apologetics. So be sure to come back next time. Thanks for watching.